news. Tickets for the Conference on Religious Trauma, Court 2023, are now available. Also, if you're interested in an ad-free version of the Divorcing Religion podcast, come join me over on Patreon. Links for both are in the show notes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. Today's show does come with a content warning, as we will be discussing sexual abuse and misconduct. I'm excited for you to meet today's guest, who shares my passion for exposing trauma perpetrated in religious and spiritual communities, and also shares my passion for supporting victims and survivors. My guest today is former corporate investigator turned cult investigator, Carol Murchison. Carol spent many years in corporate law. Later in her career, she was asked to conduct training for leaders of various Buddhist communities, and the response she received was one of open hostility. Religious leaders simply were not interested in understanding how large corporations worked to ensure that their staff were safe. This led Carol to the realization that corporate America, which is not typically known for its high moral and ethical standards, was actually doing far better than religious America when it came to stamping out abuse. Carol has since joined McAllister Oliverius, where she heads up a practice covering sexual misconduct in religious, faith-based, and spiritual communities. As an investigator, Carol has worked to uncover sexual misconduct within the Shambhala International Lineage of Buddhism, the Shivananda Yoga Vedanta Centers, and she's currently assisting other spiritual communities in bringing allegations of sexual misconduct to light. Carol has worked with survivors of abuse and misconduct across a number of global spiritual and religious movements and has extensive experience as both a litigator and an investigator. Carol's work shines a light on the failures of many spiritual centers and retreats and the abuse of power by cult leaders. And I am so glad to have Carol with us today. Hi, Carol. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Janice. I'm delighted to be here.
The work that you're doing is so exciting. It makes me want to stand up and cheer because it's so needed. And I feel like it's been a long time in coming. So the fact that you're kind of specializing in this and really this is what you're doing now with your skill set and the knowledge that you have, I'm so glad. So thank you for doing that.
You are welcome. It is indeed, it's a very exciting place to be in terms of the law right now. And of course, as you've said, sharing that passion for helping people who have been abused and have been abused in spiritual and religious communities is, I really think that we're having a moment, as they say.
That's the truth. You're located in the United States.
I am. McAllister Oliverius has its office in London or outside of London, but I go to the London office, but I work remotely in the United States, and all of my cases are either in Canada or the United States.
Oh, very good. I'm in Canada myself, so I'm glad to know that you're doing work on this side of the border as well. The podcast is Divorcing Religion, and so I'm wondering if religion has touched your life or influenced you, influenced you in any way.
Well, I was raised in a Protestant denomination, and so not certainly in a cult-like situation. And then I had some encounters with Buddhism, which was interesting given that later I came to be investigating Shambhala, which is a Buddhist lineage. But it's an interesting, I think of the name of your podcast, Divorcing Religion, and I think that probably I am divorced from religion in the sense that maybe I'm a humanist.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're in very good company then, because I would count myself a humanist too. And I grew up in a very fundamentalist Christian home. And when I left that behind, I certainly spent time in exploring Buddhism and Eastern traditions. And that was very interesting to me also. And now I'm at a point where I don't do either. But I know that a lot of folks who are watching and listening today, that's a direction that they've gone in. So I think it's important, wherever we're at on the spectrum of spiritual belief, that we keep our wits about us, that we recognize that there are some predators out there. There are people even who've just gotten caught up in their own power and are doing things that are untoward.
Yes.
And this is what we'll be looking at today. And I find that predators have the opportunity to thrive in communities where obedience is demanded and required, and so is secrecy. And so this is something we want to blow the lid off of. We want people to know that their bodies belong to them. And that's an important thing to consider, because if you grow up in a religious home, often you feel like it doesn't belong to you.
Yes. Or that your mind does not belong to you, or that you must that you must do things that a small voice inside of you tells you is not the right thing for you. But a leader who has been, and this is my experience in the cases that I have, a leader who you've been taught that this leader knows what is better for you than what you do, that their judgment is better than yours. Those are dangerous situations. So all of the things that you mentioned are really markers, the lack of control, the power imbalance, all of those things are things that we see in the cases that we have.
I wonder, so in a lot of the situations that I'm working with clients in, the whole notion of patriarchy is also very much at play, and women and children feeling like they don't have a voice. They can't speak against the male leader or the male perpetrator of abuse, maybe even in their own family. Does patriarchy come through in the work that you do as well, do you think?
Yes, I think absolutely. I would say that maybe not 100%, but certainly 95% of the abuse situations that we see are male leaders abusing female and or children followers.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty strong.
If we think about the patriarchy as a power issue, of course, then it's that power that these leaders of these communities have that creates the system that allows the abuse to occur.
Yes. And I wonder, do you have an idea of the percentage of victims who maybe did they grow up in the cults? Are they first or second generation, or did they come to it in adulthood?
I think both. I think each of those situations carries a slightly different kind of a problem with it. So the first generation, the person who's born into the cult really has nothing to compare. When we're children, we take everything as normal, and we don't necessarily know that something is wrong or bad for us. And so that has its own difficulties. I think that the people who come in later life are often people who are seekers. They're looking for something on the spiritual path. They find something where the teachings are very powerful to them. The teachings speak to them in some way. And then that is weaponized often against them. But because what we know about coercion happens gradually, it's like falling a little bit deeper and deeper and deeper into something until you don't see a way to get out. But I think that, one of the things that I've been learning about in my work in the last couple of years is that as a society, we think of people who get involved in these cult situations and get abused in cult situations. And we look at them and we think, that would never happen to me. Mm-hmm. But it's not true. I really believe that given the kind of wrong place and wrong time, that any of us could fall prey to these kinds of people. Yeah. And so I really have a profound respect for people who are willing to come forward and bring the kinds of claims that we're bringing, because it exposes them in a lot of ways to people who are like, well, that would never happen. Or, why didn't you have better sense than that? Those scolding voices in our society.
Yeah, the victim blaming.
Yes, that's exactly what it is at heart. It is the victim blaming. And yet, what I find is that people who have been involved in these are kind people, smart people, trusting people. Mm-hmm. They're the kind of people that are good for society and culture and civilization. And what we don't do is we don't blame enough the person who betrays the trust of their followers.
Wow, that's so true. And in some ways, I feel like that again falls right in league with patriarchy, yes. Since most of the, abusers that you are dealing with are men. And a lot of the victims are not men. And certainly I have experienced myself, and I see with my clients, growing up in a very religious home can prime us to think that certain things are normal, or so that it feels normal to us when someone is being very dogmatic, authoritarian, yes. Telling us what to think, what to wear, how to behave. So even though we can be grateful that, wow, I managed to get myself out of that fundamentalist religion, we still can kind of take that fundamentalist mindset along with us into other groups that we may end up joining, and they may be also authoritarian in structure. And I think people might find it surprising to think that can happen in yoga communities, because we think of yoga as gentle and enlightened because it's an Eastern concept. So we have all these, nice flowery ways to think about it and talk about it. But there is abuse that goes on in various yoga communities. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So, I think the thing that you undoubtedly encounter this all the time, Janice, is that, this happens in all different religions. It's not really about the belief system, right? It's really about a power structure and an abuse of power. And so that can happen anywhere. But the things that make it more possible to happen often happen in communities where people are isolated from other people. So that's the first thing. So what happens to some of my clients, what has happened to them is that they have been seekers. They've been looking for a spiritual path that was meaningful for them, which is a very positive thing for people to do. And then they've been often at a time in their life when they were in transition. Mm-hmm. They've lost their job and they haven't started the next part of their life yet. Those kinds of things. And so a number of our clients have had that kind of situation, and they have thought, well, I'm going to go to this ashram. I'm going to go to a yoga community because I'm going to learn the practice and the philosophy and the teachings of yoga. But what happens, not all the time, of course, but in some cases, is that it becomes a breeding ground for this kind of authoritarian control. And the authoritarian control is, well, if you look at some of the, kind of the indicators of coercion, everyone has to dress the same way. Everyone has to eat the same way. There's in language, the kind of in, talk and jargon. And what happens sometimes is that the people who are working there are not being paid. So they're doing selfless service, which is, of course, it sounds like, and probably in the right circumstances, is a very spiritual thing to engage in. But after you do that for a while, the practical reality is that you do not have any money. And if you do not have any money, then you may not even have a way to leave, even if you want to leave, when your boundaries are being violated.
Right.
And sometimes that's sexual, sometimes it's psychological, sometimes it's financial, all of those things. And so that isolation that happens in retreat centers, in yoga ashrams, there's nothing wrong with it as long as there is not an abuse of power that's taking place. But when we have those situations, it's like fertile breeding ground for an abuse of power. So myself, what I look at is the very first thing that jumps out at me is there a teaching that the leader is infallible? If the leader cannot be wrong, then you cannot question anything that happens, and that becomes normalized. And pretty soon, more and more boundaries are broken. So, yoga just happens to be one place where those boundaries can be violated because the kind of the circumstances, the container, if you will, is there. It could be a retreat I was going to say millions, that's probably an overstatement. There are probably thousands of self-help cults in the United States. We just saw one that was, the owners were indicted in one called One Taste. And so they're being prosecuted for forced labor. And I really do think that we're going to see more of these organizations that are isolating people from society and using their labor as part of their business model. We may see more of these claims in the future.
Yes, definitely. I appreciate that you used the word vulnerable or vulnerability. Everyone is vulnerable at some point, and typically it's when we are in a time of transition in our life. So it might be we've lost a spouse or a partner or a job. We've moved away to a new city to attend college or university for the first time. Something has happened that puts us a little bit off kilter, and then we are vulnerable. And of course, a lot of cults actually operate knowing that, that's the time to reach out to that person. That's why they proliferate in college and university cities and settings. So anybody is vulnerable. And then when you're talking about basically free labor, I mean, exploitation, there's a line that gets crossed into exploitation. And I see this not only in cults, that are recognized as cults. I see it sometimes in churches, church communities, in families as well, sometimes where the parents maybe own a business. And of course, the children then are cheap or free labor. So it's all out of balance. It gets all out of whack. And that's just very interesting to me. And I do, as you're talking about some of these things that have gone on in various yoga centers and self-help retreats, recovery type things, I do see some of those things going on in church settings as well. So really, it's a human thing that can happen in so many situations.
I think it's completely, it's not about a particular religion, as evidenced by the fact that we see it across all religions. You know, we saw the kind of abuse in the Catholic Church that we still see, where someone has a position of power that you are not allowed to question. And so whether it's the Catholic Church, whether it's a Protestant denomination, whether it is Buddhism or yoga or the Church of God or whatever these things may be, they are just the containers that are propagating, taking the teachings that people want to have and that are valuable and weaponizing them against the very people who are, seekers and people who are trusting the world around them.
Oh, absolutely. I find over and over again that what we crave as humans is certainty, security, order, and acceptance. And religions and cults just tie that up with a shiny red ribbon. And so it makes it, well, when you first enter into a relationship and you've got your rose-colored glasses on, but when you're wearing rose-colored glasses, a red flag just looks like a flag. It looks like any other thing. You don't even notice it. You're feeling so good. There's potentially love bombing taking place, or lots of heightened emotions. And so we don't even see that we're taking step after step that might be getting us deeper and more entrenched into something that can be very hard to get out of.
That is absolutely true. I see it in almost every case that we have. With children, it sometimes operates differently, right? Because children are not really, depending on their ages, certainly not able to make those kinds of conscious decisions. But even as adults, what I find is that the processing one's way out of this kind of authoritarian control, the patriarchy, the coerciveness is very, very difficult, and it takes years. And unfortunately, and this is one of the kind of trials of those of us lawyers who try to bring accountability in these cases, is that the law does not give us many tools, and the tools that they give us are flawed. And so, for example, we know that there are longer statutes of limitations, that is the period of time in which you can bring a claim when a person is a child. But I can tell you in my experience that the processing that needs to be done by an adult to be able to understand what happened to them in a cult is a long time process. And in the meantime, the law has set a ticking clock that expires long before the person actually knows what happened to them. And people find that very, I think, hard to believe.
Right.
They say, well, if you were raped, then you knew what happened to you. But one of my clients said to me, if this had happened to me in a dark alley by a stranger, I would have known that I'd been raped. But because it was told to me as a spiritual practice, as something that I needed to do, maybe even for the longevity and good of the teacher, that you are giving something of yourself to this teacher that the teacher needs. Whatever it has been packaged as takes a long time to unravel. And unfortunately, in a lot of different states, the law doesn't give us much time to do that. And so it's very hard. It's one of the reasons why we don't have as many cases as we should have. of these kinds. It's because people will come to me and say, this happened to me in 2014, for example. And in Michigan, and when you look up the statute of limitations, you find that it's just a couple of years. And you don't have an ability to bring the claim. So one of the things that that on my wish list of things is that more states would do what some states have done, which is New York, for example, has an open look back window now, so that anyone who has been sexually assaulted in the state of New York can bring a claim no matter when it happened until this November. So then that window will close and we won't have that opportunity. California has a very similar thing. Some states are eliminating their statutes of limitations on sexual assault. And Janice, in Canada, thank you, you lovely Canadian people, there is no statute of limitations on sexual assault. And so that's where I feel that we need to go, because I feel that the trauma of it often requires so much time for people to process that the law has blocked them out of the doorway to the courthouse.
Yes, you're exactly right. And I know when we're looking at cases where the abuse has occurred within the family, it can take even longer, decades and decades before the victim or survivor is able to actually name what happened, because there's just so much tied in and wrapped around, and concern about other family members. And certainly it can be similar then when someone has been taken advantage of or abused in a spiritual setting. And I know that there are some spiritual predators who actually have told the victims that it's for their own salvation, that they must do these things. And if you're on the outside of it and you haven't had these experiences, I know that it can sound crazy and hard to believe, but what is very important is that we exercise compassion when people have the courage to come forward and tell us that something horrible happened to them. So just to listen.
It's a tremendous courage that is required. It requires tremendous courage to come forward, which I don't think that we give as much credit on that as we should. We're involved in a lot of scolding and victim blaming, and certainly the devotees of certain religions and spiritual groups are, out there front and center, loud and clear, saying this couldn't have happened. This is a gold digger. This is somebody who's out for money. I mean, these are all of the things that we hear when what we ought to be saying is that there is nothing that is a positive about that we have created in our society for someone to come forward and point the finger at a revered spiritual leader. It is simply requires an amount of courage that is simply impossible for the rest of us to understand.
I'm curious about something with regard to the gurus that you have encountered who have perpetrated these things. Are they largely American born, or are they sometimes they are American or Canadian, or sometimes they have come from other countries and set up their communes or whatever it is here?
Yes, both. Actually. So yes, we have some who are Western, I would say, kind of part of the Western world, who have adopted these kind of weaponized teachings and are propagating abuse on their, the members of their communities. Certainly we have seen that, as well as we have seen people come out of the East who are born into these religions and are bringing those beliefs to the United States and Canada, for sure. So we see both.
Is it it trickier than to use the law against those people who were actually raised in it? Does it come up that, oh, well, I was taught that it was normal or something like that? Can they use that excuse? Do they use that excuse?
Well, that in the United States, we have we give tremendous latitude to religious beliefs and for people's right to be able to practice the religion of their choice, all of which is well and good. There's a line that you can't cross, and so you can't say, well, I'm going to rape people, I'm going to sexually assault people because that's a part of my religion. And, there's always an issue of consent. That's another area where we desperately need more education and more advocacy on, although I do think that our thoughts about consent are changing in our cultures. But in these organizations where there is a huge power imbalance, I think we have an understanding in the United States and Canada that you may not be able to consent. So, for example, I was an employment lawyer. And in employment law, there is this kind of sense that if you're the boss, if you hold the power of my job over me, then if you tell me that I need to have sex with you, and even if it's just implying that I'll lose my job if I don't do it, then there's some liability in that for an employer. We understand that. We know that work is important to us as people in our society, and that should not be held over our head. I think, and I hope, at least, that part of what we are doing is helping to extend that idea to these situations where there is this huge power imbalance. If you think about it, most states have some kind of, at least, sense in the law that if you are a psychologist, a therapist, you should not be having sex with your clients because there's too much of a power issue at play. And I think of these situations as exactly the same thing, where it's not about the religious teaching and that people cannot consent. It's, we're using, and your listeners might be interested in this, one of the tools that we're using is the federal human trafficking law, which is, whenever I say that, then people look at me like, well, but what about cults and religions is trafficking? Because we think of trafficking as moving people across a state line or a boundary, maybe putting people in a truck and coming across the border from Mexico into something like that. But it isn't actually required under the law. The notion of trafficking is quite different under the law. It means having some connection to interstate commerce, which can be satisfied by many different things like advertising your retreat center on the internet. But what it really does talk about, which I think applies in our view to cults and these kinds of authoritarian spiritual communities, is that it requires enticing or recruiting someone to engage in what the law calls a commercial sex act, which, and another, kind of like anomaly, doesn't have anything to do with commerce or money. It could just be an exchange, but that exchange is coercion or fraudulent. And so a lot of the cases that we see look like that. They look like someone who is recruited or enticed to engage in sex with the leader of the community because they are fraudulently told that this will result in good karma, or this will result in the long life of the teacher, or this is some kind of, whatever it may be. And that is either coercion or fraudulent. And if you think about Harvey Weinstein, he was charged. He had claims brought against him in New York on human trafficking. And it was that he enticed young actresses to engage in sex on the fraudulent promise that he would get them, interviews with big producers. He was going to make their career. And a lot of those cases were successful. And so, one of the things that's interesting about that law is that it doesn't say anything about consent. And so we don't have to prove or disprove consent on either side. It just says this happened. And so you couldn't consent because it was fraudulent or coercive. So we're early in the practice of that claim, but we're looking at it with increased optimism as a way to bring accountability to cults.
Am I right in thinking that the United Kingdom is farther ahead than North America when it comes to recognizing coercive control under the law?
Yes, I understand that is the case. Indeed. I don't practice in the UK, but I have heard that the UK and specifically Scotland, someone mentioned to me, have very advanced laws on coercion. And you're right, we do not have that kind of understanding of the psychological role of coercion in these situations in the United States and Canada.
That seems like something important to be looking into.
Yes. And, an increasing number of people are focusing in that area. I know that there's an organization called the International Cultic Studies Association, where there's a lot of folks who have worked on the psychological and issues of coercion, and they have a website that people can go to and look at some of those things. I think we need to be doing more study, more understanding of the way that our brains work, and then the law has to change to accommodate that. The idea that if you are 18 years old, as opposed to 16 years old, that it's going to take you, 4 years to process something and come forward is misguided. It's something that is easily disproven in research. But we haven't caught up with that yet.
Wouldn't it be magnificent if the whole concept, the psychology behind coercive control was taught in schools so that young people had an understanding of it? That would be so fantastic.
Wow. And more into my home territory, that it were taught to judges and lawyers and court personnel. I know I've spoken recently to some people who are working in the justice system in the area of domestic violence, which is very much connected, obviously, to coercive control. And we're seeing some laws in a couple of states that do get at that. But our court system and our personnel and our judges don't necessarily understand the role of coercion in either domestic violence situations or these sexual abuse situations.
Do you see any parallels between coercion and indoctrination? Are they related somehow, do you think?
It's an interesting question. So I would, right off the top of my head, without any, kind of like big scientific or legal thought behind it, I would think they are. I would think they must share a lot of threads, of the same threads.
Yes. Wow. Well, when we're looking at people who are coming to you recognizing that something went on that was not right in their group that they were involved with, who is at fault? Is it only the leader who is at fault? Are there board members? Are there people who should have seen what was going on, or how does that work?
Yes. Well, it's such a really it is, in a way, the heart of what we are doing, because what we find is that survivors of this kind of abuse have often been shunned from the communities that they were a part of because they raised this to people who were leaders or who were board members and who ignored it. And so what I find is a lot of people who are survivors of this kind of thing want accountability not only from the person who assaulted them, but also from the organization that ignored them, or beyond ignoring, took active actions to try to retaliate against them. So there are really two prongs to a lawsuit that we try to find. It isn't always possible. But yes, organizations that ignore having either known or having should have known another, kind of element of a lot of legal claims is that you can't just close your eyes. You can't just say, well, I didn't see it because you had your hands over your eyes. If you should have known, then you can also be held liable. And I find that this is what looks like justice for a lot of the people who come to us and want to be engaged in a lawsuit. It's not an easy process to be in a lawsuit. And the justice that they're looking for, the accountability that they want to see happen, the change that they want to see happen is with both the perpetrator and the organization that allowed it.
So when we think of groups like NXIVM, who were in the news over the last many years, and the leader now is imprisoned for the terrible things that he did, that was more along the lines of kind of a self-help group, rather than you're specifically working with spiritual and religious communities where there's been abuse.
Yes, although what we're finding is that a lot of the spiritual and religious communities where this kind of abuse is taking place, and I don't mean, like there's one bad apple that does something. I mean, we have that in society, right? We have it in the workplace. It's not, I was smiling when you read my introduction earlier that I said corporate America is doing better than religious America. It's not that they don't have it happen. They do. It's that they know how to deal with it and they have a healthy fear of the law, right? So the thing with what we're finding is that whether you are self-help, which is a kind of spiritual group in a certain way, whether you are one of the big five religions, or whether you have a one-off cult group, somewhere in Texas, and you have just one, you have 25 followers and no matter what, they all have the same thread. They're all doing the same thing, whether it's a self-help teaching, whether it's a spiritual teaching, a religious teaching, a faith-based teaching, whatever it is. When it has permeated the organization so that it is accepted, it's not just the one bad apple, that people, when they hear about it, take action and are concerned about it. Those are the situations that we are most apt to see, whether they're the NXIVM kinds of things of self-help or one taste. You'll look, your viewers too will look, if you Google them, you'll see that they've just been indicted on forced labor. They were a kind of self-help teaching orgasmic meditation, which right away I would have concerns about. I would have concerns that if you are using forced labor and people get roped into something, that there's going to be some abuse. Because as you said before, we're human and that's what we do.
Wow. Yes. What I'm curious, what drew you into this whole place of working with cult survivors?
I guess that the first thing I would say is that I have been an absolute failure at retirement. That's the first mistake. The second um, is that I offered to do a pro bono project with a woman who was looking at sexual misconduct in a Buddhist community in Canada. And I I had reached out to her, and because my own background had been investigating sexual misconduct in corporations, I said to her, "What they need to do is they need to do an investigation. Tell them that they need to do an investigation." And she said, "Well, they're not going to do an investigation because they're no longer even speaking to me because I dared, to kind of raise these issues." And so I had a kind of one maybe I had maybe a second of should I take this on in my retirement? And then, of course, I said, well, let me just look at what you have. And then I think within a week or two, we had a number of women who'd come forward who accused the leader of the organization of sexual misconduct, of a great many sexual assaults. And I got involved. Obviously, I was already involved, and I did an investigation. I tried to bring it to the attention of their board. They were not interested. And then we went public with a couple of reports. Other women came forward. Ultimately, the board stepped down and the leader went to India, where I believe he still is. And that got a lot of press. And I have to say that one of the great partners in these kinds of cases are the fabulous and courageous journalists who are willing to write about these things and alert people so that they know this happened to be a situation that got a lot of press. And then I started having people come forward. You said before, Janice, the kind of people able to name things, people said, wow, I now see that this is a thing that can happen, and it happened to me. And would you do the same thing? And so I had a pro bono practice of investigating for about 4 years. But what I found is that nobody wanted to do anything at the organization level. So when I met Anne Oliverius, who's a fierce fighter for women in particular, and she asked me to join the firm, I thought, this is the next step. The next step is we've tried everything. We've tried talking, we've tried persuasion, we've tried media, we've tried every kind of leverage that we have. And the last leverage that is available is the law. And so now that is what we're doing. And that's how I have gotten to getting an F plus in retirement.
Wow. That's just marvelous. That's quite a story of how you came to be doing this work when you were retired, when you were supposed to be retired. But now you're doing such good work. I'm grateful that you dusted off your law books and came back in, and you're doing such an important thing on behalf of victims and survivors. Thank you for what you're doing.
Well, I have a wonderful team that I work with of lawyers and legal analysts, paralegals, who are also extremely committed to this cause. And people, we fight very hard to find a way to creatively bring claims that the law doesn't necessarily give us a straightforward way to do. But it's, it's nothing compared to the people who stand up and say, I am a survivor of this sexual abuse and I want to speak out about it. Because that is, for many people, it is walking away from communities, from friends, from family, and standing up for what they believe is right. So they're our inspiration every day.
Yes, a few minutes ago you mentioned the practice of shunning, and that is such a despicable and horrifying and sometimes deadly
Yes.
practice. I would love to see something enacted from a legal standpoint to help people who are victims of shunning, and to let the various groups know that that is not an acceptable
Yeah.
practice to have.
I think you're right. In the workplace, where I did my prior legal career, we have a concept of retaliation. So, most of us have been employed by somebody, and if you bring a claim, if you bring a complaint forward, you know that you should not be retaliated against. It probably says that in your harassment policy that you shouldn't be you can't be retaliated against for bringing forward these claims. And yet we have no protections in place for any of these groups. And of course, one of the hallmarks of these groups is that they do not allow transparency or
Mhm,
healthy discussion or differences of points of view. That
mhm.
you can almost guarantee that when that is the case, there is going to be some abuse of power.
I feel like there must be a way somehow for us to help educate people, the general public. So, and then maybe this goes back to what I was saying about teaching it in schools and high schools, but so
Yes.
that people will be more quickly able to recognize this is not right. This doesn't seem right. And so it's not just a feeling they have inside, but it's connected to the knowledge that, oh no, they're actually not allowed to be doing this, to be forcing or encouraging people to behave in this way.
Yes. And it's very difficult. You asked me before about the people who are second generation, versus people who've come in as adults. And both of them have difficulties in processing this kind of thing. But clearly, the people who are second generation who've been taught this since childhood, um, the process of coming to understand is very, very difficult. The process of feeling and rationalizing and all of the things that we know, we're doing such wonderful things with what I think of as brain science.
Mhm,
How do our brains work? I'd
mhm.
like to see us really bring our knowledge of that to these situations so that the law could see that what we're asking people to do simply isn't possible in about 90% of the situations.
Mhm. Oh boy, yes. Do you have, just as we're coming to a close here, um, do you have any uh, words or advice or encouragement for people who maybe are just waking up to this idea that they have been taken advantage of? Maybe they are even still in the group.
Yes.
What steps might they take?
Well, some of them are difficult, right? Because if you're isolated, like one of the things that I always think of is that if you were living in the outside world and not in an insular community, you might call up a girlfriend and go and have coffee. And you'd say, this is what they're telling me to do. And that person sitting across from you over a coffee would say to you, that just doesn't sound right to me.
Hmm.
So one of the things in the absence of that is if you are still involved, there is somewhere inside of us a voice that is saying, I wonder if that is really okay. I would listen to that voice. I
Hmm.
would really empower that voice. I think therapists often talk about parts of ourselves who are children or who are different stages of us. I would talk to that voice and encourage that voice and love that voice and allow that voice to speak out in you, even if you can't speak it to someone else.
Hmm.
If you are outside of the cult and you are beginning to recognize that things that crossed your boundaries were not okay, um, Well, I will give you my email. I speak to everyone that comes forward to me as we try to assess whether there is a legal claim. And even when people don't want to make a legal claim, sometimes they just want to tell somebody what happened. They want to tell their story because they've been silenced. And so I would say, don't allow your voice to be silenced. If you're still inside, and if you're outside, speak your voice to someone else and tell them what has happened to you. And I think for a lot of people that helps to clarify. There's something in the speaking,
Mhm. Mhm.
that helps us therapeutically.
So true. And I'm very pleased that you will be joining us at Court, the Conference on Religious
Yes.
Trauma, a different type of court. And that'll be in October online, and tickets are available for sale now. And I will include your contact information in the show notes. And
Excellent.
also, of course, I'll have a link for tickets to Court 2023. Carol, thank you for joining me today. It's been so interesting. It's such a delight getting to know you.
Janice, thank you for the work that you're doing and for having me here today. It has been a pleasure for me as well.
Wonderful. And thanks to you for tuning in today. And I hope that we'll see you again soon. Take care, everyone.